22nd chapter of St. Matthew, beginning at the 15th verse. The Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarii. And he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. How many of you in the past week, or maybe in the past month, have been involved in a situation where you were talking to a group of people and you were asked a question for your opinion? And as you thought about it, you thought, any answer that I give is going to alienate somebody. It's going to make somebody upset. And you probably declined even answering the question. Jesus found himself in this situation quite a bit. And very often it seems that he didn't answer the question that they gave. And sometimes when I hear people relate to this text, I think they are treating it very lightly. This text that we have today on the coin and saying, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God." I've looked at this text for 60 years and felt it of such insignificance that I never preached on it. And so I came to it this week and saw that it was the message, it was the text last Sunday when I read it Sunday night for today. And I prayed for help to work with this text. I believe it is very relevant because what is happening in our church today is very much affected by the message given in this text. So you know the situation, you know the story. It's recorded, it's one of those few stories that is recorded in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The people come to Jesus, the Pharisees and Herodians in this particular text of Matthew, and they ask him a question. And it sounds like they're just there to trap him. And I'm not so sure that that's the case, but I'll get to that in a minute. But they ask him the question, is it legal, is it our responsibility to pay tribute to Caesar, to the emperor? And Jesus says, "Give me a coin, which you pay the tax." And so they give him a coin, and he looks at it and he said, "Whose inscription is this?" And they said, "It's Caesar's." And then he gives that statement, "Well, then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God." Because one of the things he was probably pretty sure of is that he didn't render unto God the things that were God's either. But this is a very powerful statement, and I don't know if he could have answered it any better, because it is not just a flippant statement. And if we would regard this really seriously in our day, we wouldn't probably having the churches split up, because the churches are mainly splitting on political issues, not religious ones. Not if they were sticking to what they're supposed to be doing, which is preaching the gospel. So the important question that they're really asking is, what is the relationship of the individual, of the Christian, the individual Christian, what is his relation to the state? How should he be regarding the state? Does he have any allegiance to the state whatsoever if he's a Christian? Can he just not be involved just in religious things? This issue never came up for the first couple hundred years of Christianity. But in 312, under Roman rule, Constantine came to the throne. And instead of having Christianity as just one of the many cult religions in his kingdom, he elevated it to a place of respect. Up until that time, Christians were just regarded incidentally by the Roman government. They really didn't have any input into the government whatsoever. There were a couple of persecutions, general persecutions of the Christians, but generally, if the Christians just went along with the place that they lived in the city they lived in the province, and celebrated those gods, those pagan gods' feast days, they were perfectly okay. It was just another of the many religions. It was a polytheistic society. But in 312, Christianity was given some status. It was accepted as a major player in the religious world. In 392, Theodosius I, the emperor at that time, made Christianity the official religion of the realm. And it was at that time the church started to have a voice in politics. By the time of what we Protestants call was the first Pope, Pope Leo, the end of the 6th century, Christianity had become very prominent in making decisions in state matters. For the next 900 years, there was a fight between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor as to who had the greatest status. Was the church to have service over the government, or was the government able to tell the church what to do? It was a constant struggle, and sometimes the government went out, sometimes the papacy went out. But now we get to the Reformation era. In the early 1500s, the church is calling the shots. It is basically running governments. It is telling them how to run their secular society. And traditionally, what happens once the church becomes all-powerful is that they misuse what they have. And that was certainly happening in Germany when this young man, Martin Luther, appeared on the scene and started looking at the way the church was running things and was not impressed by it. He went to Rome itself to see if he could get some inspiration that the government was being run according to God's laws, and came back very despondent. The princes in Germany were getting a little uneasy too, because of the amount of revenue that the Pope was taking out of their country. Not only were they having a political tax, but they were also now coming to the rank and file Christians and stealing a lot more money in selling of indulgences. The time was rough for a confrontation of how a Christian should serve in terms of the government. Between the time of 1517, when Luther posted the 95 Theses on the door in Wittenberg, and the time at the Diet of Worms in 1521, when he was officially excommunicated and was made a scourge of the government and was threatened with murder, he wrote 2 treatises that actually form a lot of what we think about in terms of the relationship between the individual and his Christian commitment and his allegiance to the government. The first one he wrote was The Freedom of the Christian Man. And he said, the Christian man is free from the rules of law in his conscience, in his inner life, his private life, and the state has no responsibility or no ability to tell people what they believe, and the church doesn't have any right to lay down a bunch of rules for salvation. That's given by God. So, the Christian man is free in his spiritual life to believe what he wants and to frame out his own salvation with fear and trembling, Luther called it. But Luther said there are 2 kingdoms that we serve in. One is the religious realm of God, and the other is the political realm of the secular. The individual is responsible to both. In his private life, he is subject to the rules of God, but as a citizen of society, he is also a responsibility to the prince. The laws are there not for Christians because Christians should live above the law. If a Christian lives with love and care, compassion, and forgiveness, he's not going to steal, he's not going to murder, he's going to honor his parents, he's going to worship, he's going to put God first. He doesn't have to worry about him and the laws. But as a member of a secular society in which he lives, he is responsible also to the princes. He exists, and the law exists for evildoers, how they must be punished. Christians outwardly are subject to laws and the temporal authority. In his treatise on the Christian man, he made these points. The political realm is the external use of the law, and it uses law, servitude, coercion, and violence. Luther was a very practical man. He made the statement that the prince is God's hangman. That's almost shuddering when you think about it. But he said, if there is a group of people who are intent on ruling all other people and destroying their lives, then we have to use force to stop them. Human laws serve God also, and they need to be obeyed. Believers live above the law, but they are subject to the law. Then he made some statements that we don't like at all. Christians should not fight back in terms of your political arena, even if you are treated unruly. It is unchristian for common people to rebel even against unjust judges. We don't like that one either. But Luther was not a pacifist. Luther said, you serve the neighbor in defense of the state. he said an army is necessary. It's okay to participate in war for the defense of the innocent and to resist the evildoer is part of our responsibility. This commitment, this religious commitment kind of to the military is particularly a Lutheran thing. Obedience to the prince is not only allowed, but is expected. But then he wrote a second treatise called A Letter to the Christian Nobility, the ones who ruled, in other words, the princes. And he said the rulers have a responsibility to protect the church, but they are not to interfere in the theology or the beliefs of that church. It was the first statement where we talk about religious liberty, freedom of religion, which is very much a part of our Constitution. He said, freedom of religion is a responsibility of the nobility and to protect the church and not to interfere. They are separate items. And so, we come to this point where we see him saying primarily the same thing that Jesus says. There are two realms. Jesus himself, in speaking to Pontius Pilate and to Herod, said, I am not a part of this kingdom. My kingdom is different. My kingdom is an allegiance to God, but we have allegiance to the society in which we live. Well, there were three basic ideas of the relationship of the church to the state. One was the Catholic, which says the state should be regulated by the church. And that is really the official declaration of the Catholic Church up until about 60 years ago. At this particular time, the Catholic Church is also talking about freedom of religion for our fallen brethren. We live now in a situation in our country whereby it seems the church is getting way too involved in the political realm. One of the questions was asked in the Christian Century, one of the fastest growing non-denominational churches in America. And they said, what is the core reason for your immense growth? And the answer they gave was, first of all, most important of all, we do not get political. We concentrate on what the church was asked to do, which is to proclaim the gospel, keep the faith of our members, and to create a world through our individual Christians that enrich the living of other people. We have had several decisions that are political in nature made by our particular denomination, and we have chosen to write to them and said we will not honor them. We are particularly concerned to be a church. And then we are turned around and sometimes criticized for our God country or having the American flag. But as Christians, Luther told us that we also have an obligation to the state because that too is ruled by God, but to keep them in proper perspective. When Jesus was asked the question, is it justifiable, is it legal to pay tribute to Caesar? He answered the question the only way it could be done. The Herodians had good reason for asking him that question, because the Herodians, well, first of all, the Pharisees were pacifists, and they justified the Roman government and went along with most of what they did. The Herodians wanted to satisfy the Roman government because they wanted to continue the house of Herod to rule, or have an essential part of the rule in Israel. So it was important how Christ answered that question. Because what they were afraid of is that Christ was gaining a lot of popularity at that time, and they felt that maybe the Roman government was getting a little nervous and would have a major attack on the common people of that country. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. It is a different world." We are a part of that religious world, but we are also a part of a secular world in which we obey the government. But it does not come first in our lives. But most of all, the church has to remember that its primary task, and maybe its only task, is simply to preach the gospel. Christ crucified, Christ risen, and our eternal being resting in that grace. All other things are something of another kingdom, rendered to Caesar. Amen. Sermon hymn, "In the Garden," in the blue book, number 70. Stand as you are able.